The last thing I submitted to the Interstellar Commerce Commission, before the silence began, was a maintenance invoice. Not a declaration, not a protest, not a petition. We had filed 312 petitions in 11 years, and I had personally drafted 68 of them, and not one had been accepted for formal consideration, not one had been assigned a case number, not one had ever been read aloud in session. The Commission had a particular talent for receiving documents it chose not to acknowledge. You could hand a counselor a folder of evidence, watch his eyes move across the page, and 3 weeks later receive a form letter explaining that no such document appeared in the official record. They had perfected the administrative erasure. It was, in its way, a kind of art. So the last thing I submitted was an invoice. 47 line items: labor, materials, transit fuel, hazard supplements, station time fees accrued over the preceding fiscal cycle. The work our people had performed maintaining the Commission's relay infrastructure along the Varath corridor, 14 deep junction relay towers, each of them critical to the data throughput that made interstellar commerce function, each of them staffed exclusively by human technicians, because no Commission member species had ever volunteered for the posting. The corridor ran through a debris-dense band of former stellar collapse. The background radiation was manageable, the navigation hazardous, the accommodation Spartan, the assignment rotation 18 months on and 4 months off. In 11 years, we had turned down no assignment and missed no maintenance window. In 11 years, the Commission had paid us 63% of what the contract specified. The invoice, submitted on a Tuesday morning, was for the outstanding 37%. I filed it the same way I filed everything, through the secondary trade liaison channel, the one assigned to what the Commission internally classified as auxiliary service providers. The primary channel was for members. The secondary channel was for everyone the Commission found useful but preferred not to seat. I had been filing through the secondary channel for 6 years. I had the routing codes memorized. I could submit a document in my sleep, and some nights I felt as though I had. Then I logged out, stepped out of my office in the Human Trade Liaison Annex, a building attached to the Commission's main complex by a covered walkway that flooded in the rainy season, and I took the covered walkway for the last time. I did not announce that it was the last time. There was no announcement of any kind. That was the point. My name is Ilara Voss. I was, for 6 years, the senior trade liaison for the Terran Commerce Office attached to the Interstellar Commerce Commission's permanent assembly on Varath Station. Before that I served 3 years as a junior commercial attaché in the Commission's Outer Tier Observer Program, which was the Commission's polite term for the category of species, whose representatives were permitted to occupy a gallery seat and observe plenary sessions, but were not permitted to speak, vote, submit agenda items, or access the members' dining floor. 3 years as a silent observer. Then, when it became clear that our maintenance contracts were essential enough that someone had to actually negotiate their terms, they created the Auxiliary Service Provider Liaison Program and assigned me a desk in the annex. Not a seat in the chamber, a desk in the annex. I want to be precise about the Commission, because imprecision would be a kindness it does not deserve. The Interstellar Commerce Commission was not a government. It styled itself as one. It had a chamber, a presiding council, quorum rules, procedural bylaws that ran to 11,000 pages in the current edition, ceremonial dress codes, and a history dating to the early consolidation period that it referenced frequently and reverently. But it was, in its essential nature, a cartel. 7 member species controlled the major transit corridors, the deep junction relay networks, the antimatter fuel distribution infrastructure, and the data routing architecture that connected 240 inhabited systems. The Commission set the tariff schedules, adjudicated trade disputes, issued corridor access licensing, and crucially, decided who qualified as a member and who qualified as an auxiliary service provider. Earth qualified as an auxiliary service provider. We had been auxiliary since the first contact negotiations, 40 years before I filed my last invoice. The original assessment, conducted by a commissioned survey team that spent 11 days in orbit and 3 days on the surface, had classified humanity as a pre-framework species, meaning that our technological profile, our political structure, and our cultural orientation placed us below the threshold for member consideration. The assessment had been filed, assigned a case number, read into the record, and periodically cited as precedent whenever anyone raised the question of Earth's status. That assessment had been written in 3 days by a surveyor who, subsequent inquiry would reveal, had not spoken to a single human being face to face. He had reviewed orbital scan data, intercepted a sample of broadcast media, and consulted an existing xenological profile compiled by a different survey team that had itself never visited Earth. The assessment that defined humanity's place in the galactic economy for 40 years had been written by someone who had never met one of us. I did not know this when I took the liaison post. I learned it in my 4th year when a sympathetic archivist at the Commission's record office, a Varethi clerk named Asen, who moved with the careful deliberateness of someone who had spent 40 years ensuring that no one had reason to notice him, flagged the original survey file for me during a routine records request. He said nothing when he handed me the folder. He simply laid it on the counter and turned to his next task. I took it back to the annex, read it twice, drafted a formal correction request, submitted it through the secondary liaison channel, and received, 14 months later, a form acknowledgement informing me that the matter had been reviewed and the original assessment was confirmed as accurately reflecting the Commission's determination at the time of filing. I kept the folder. I kept every document that came back stamped with that kind of language. By the time I filed my last invoice, I had 2 filing cabinets in the annex office that contained nothing but rejected submissions, confirmation letters, non-acknowledgement notices, and procedural rulings explaining why a given matter was not admissible for consideration under current session rules. 2 filing cabinets, 11 years. The Commission met in plenary session 4 times a year, with standing committee sessions filling the calendar between them. I had attended, as gallery observer, 107 sessions in 6 years. I had sat in the gallery, 3 rows of stone benches set behind a low railing at the back of the chamber, accessible via a separate entrance from the members' floor, and watched the Commission conduct its business. I had listened to tariff schedules debated and revised. I had watched corridor access applications argued and decided. I had observed twice the formal seating of new member species, ceremonial affairs, full chamber attendance, music, the reading of the admission instrument, the presentation of the Commission's emblem to the new member's senior delegate. We were not eligible for that ceremony. The pre-framework classification precluded it. The pre-framework classification precluded, in fact, most things. It precluded member pricing on Commission-licensed transit lanes, which meant that every human ship traveling between systems paid the non-member surcharge, which ran between 22 and 35% above baseline depending on the corridor. It precluded participation in the Commission's dispute resolution mechanism, which meant that when a member species' commercial vessels damaged human-operated relay infrastructure, which had happened 6 times in the corridor we maintained, twice with significant debris fields, we filed claims through the secondary channel and received rulings in the members' favor, consistently. Because the dispute mechanism's arbiter pool consisted entirely of member species representatives, and the procedural rules gave them latitude to weight their own members' commercial interests. It precluded, most painfully, the right to tender for primary tier maintenance contracts. We could hold auxiliary contracts, the ones that member species did not want, the ones that took their workers into debris fields and radiation bands and 18-month postings in stations with no pressurized recreation facilities. But we could not hold primary contracts. Primary contracts were reserved for member species. The distinction was significant. Primary contracts paid at the full schedule rate. Auxiliary contracts paid at the auxiliary rate, which the Commission had set, without consultation, at 63% of the primary rate. 63%. The Commission had, in its 11,000-page procedural bylaw, a formula for determining the auxiliary rate. The formula contained 7 variables. 3 of them were explicitly based on the applying entity's member status. The structure was designed to produce the outcome it produced. You could not challenge it on procedural grounds because it was the procedure. In my 4th year, a junior colleague named Devraj, young, sharp, newer to the Commission than I was and still capable of genuine outrage, had suggested that we escalate. He had contacts in the outer tier. He had spent time in the Observer program. He knew people in 2 other pre-framework civilizations who were, he said, in similar positions. We could build a coalition. We could file a collective representation request. We could make the case that the auxiliary rate structure was systematically discriminatory. I had looked at him across my desk, in the annex office with the window that faced the covered walkway rather than the chamber tower, and I had thought about what to say. "We can file it," I told him. "I'll help you draft it. You should know that the Commission's procedural rules require a collective representation request to be sponsored by a minimum of 1 active member species in good standing. No member has ever sponsored one. The last time such a request was filed without a sponsor, in the 7th year of the current procedural framework, the Commission ruled it inadmissible under Rule 432, subsection 9, which holds that requests from non-member bodies that seek to modify member-tier pricing structures do not fall within the Commission's mandate as constituted. He was quiet for a moment. "So it's designed to." "Yes," I said. He filed it anyway. I helped him draft it. The Commission returned it in 8 months, inadmissible under Rule 432, subsection 9. That was year 4. We had 7 more after that. In year 5, Devraj left. He had been offered a posting with a commercial shipping concern that operated in the outer reaches beyond the Commission's jurisdiction, genuinely outside it, which meant outside the auxiliary rate, outside the pre-framework classification, outside the secondary channel. He took it. I did not blame him. I attended his leaving dinner in the annex common room, and I shook his hand at the departure port, and I went back to my desk. After he was gone, I hired a replacement, a woman named Thierry, experienced, sensible, without Devraj's remaining capacity for outrage. We worked well together. She learned the secondary channel quickly and did not take the non-responses personally, which was a professional adaptation that took most people a year to acquire. She understood the filing cabinets. She understood the gap between the work order record and the actual work. She understood, without needing it explained, what the annex building's position on Vareth Station meant and what it would take to change it. In years 5 through 7, I estimate I wrote 460 combined hours of procedural documentation, petition drafts, rate review materials, and correspondence that the Commission received and did not read. 460 hours of precise, careful, procedurally correct argument deposited into a system engineered to absorb it without responding. I kept copies of everything. I am not sure at the time that I understood why I was keeping copies with such care. I think I believed, without articulating it, that the record would matter eventually. That if we documented it all, the work done, the work underpaid, the submissions ignored, the classifications unchallenged, there would come a moment when the record could be used. I was not wrong about that. I was wrong about the shape the moment would take. I want to describe the chamber, because the chamber is part of what I want you to understand. Vareth Station was old by human standards, old by most standards, built in the early consolidation period when the Commission was new, and the architecture reflected the ambitions of the founding members. The main assembly hall was built for permanence. Polished ash stone walls, dark and veined with mineral striations that caught the light at certain hours of the day and looked almost warm. Tiered seating in a wide semicircle around the central floor, each tier assigned to a member species by charter, the assignment locked at the founding and modified only by formal amendment, which had never occurred. The chamber ceiling was high and arched, fitted with narrow clerestory windows along the upper curve that admitted daylight in long, diffuse shafts that fell across the floor and the central dais. The dais held the presiding council, 5 seats, the central seat elevated slightly above the others, occupied by the commission's rotating president. The gallery was behind the semicircle, lower than the member tiers, separated from the chamber floor by a railing and a shallow step. If you sat in the gallery and looked toward the dais, you looked across the backs of the member delegates. You saw the chamber from behind everyone who mattered. That was not accidental. I sat in that gallery for 107 sessions. I sat in those stone benches and I watched, and I filed my reports, and I submitted my invoices through the secondary channel, and I drafted my petitions, and I was present in that room in the only capacity the Commission had ever assigned me, the capacity of someone who could be useful without being acknowledged. In that time, I learned the chamber's rhythms the way you learn the habits of a place where you will never be comfortable. I knew which delegates arrived early and which arrived late, which of them made eye contact with the gallery, and which had never once looked up. I knew the sound of the gavel and the particular acoustics of a vote being called. I knew the procedural language so well I could hear a motion being introduced and tell you within 30 seconds whether it would pass on the first call or go to committee. I knew the smell of the room, ashstone, and the particular mineral filtration that Varethi Environmental Systems used, slightly dry, faintly metallic. I knew, in other words, the inside of a room I was never permitted to enter. In my 5th year, the Commission voted to reclassify the Vareth Corridor Maintenance Contract. The existing contract, under which human technicians had maintained the corridor's 14 relay towers for 8 years, was due for renewal. The Commission's standard renewal process involved a review committee, a term and rate assessment, and a vote by the full chamber. The review committee's assessment, submitted 3 weeks before the vote, recommended a reduction in the contract scope. 4 of the 14 towers would be removed from the scope and assigned to a newly formed maintenance subsidiary of a member company at primary rate compensation. The 4 towers being removed from our scope were the 4 highest traffic towers, the ones generating the most throughput data, which translated directly to the most maintenance hours and the highest hazard supplement. Removing them reduced our contract value by approximately 40%. Adding them to a member subsidiary's primary rate contract gave that subsidiary, which had no prior relay tower maintenance experience, the Commission's most lucrative maintenance assignment. Devraj drafted a formal objection. I reviewed it. We submitted it through the secondary channel. The vote proceeded on schedule. The reclassification passed on a 7-0 vote, the presiding council abstaining per procedural custom. Devraj and I sat in the gallery. I watched it happen. I watched the chamber president read the motion, watched the tally clerk confirm the vote count, watched the amendment to the contract schedule be formally entered into the record. I did not look at Devraj. I watched the chamber president sign the amendment instrument and hand it to the record clerk. I watched the record clerk file it. Then I stood up and I left the gallery. I did not make a sound. I did not look at anyone. I simply stood and walked to the gallery exit and pushed through the door into the corridor outside, and I kept walking until I reached the annex building, and I sat down at my desk and I began making calculations. Not that day, not the next, but I began. Let me tell you what the Commission did not know, because it had never needed to know. The 14 relay towers of the Vareth corridor did not function in isolation. They were nodes in a nested maintenance architecture that human technicians had, over 8 years of operations, quietly rationalized and improved. The original commission design called for each tower to be serviced independently, on independent maintenance cycles, with independent spare parts logistics running through separate commission supply chains. The original design was inefficient. It was the kind of design produced by an engineering committee that had never actually worked in a debris field, that had designed on paper and handed the result to contractors and walked away. Human technicians had not walked away. They had lived in those towers for 8 years. They had worked out that if you synchronized the maintenance cycles of the 14 towers in a specific rotation, you could cut redundant supply runs by 40% and reduce emergency response time by half, because you always had a team positioned within 1 transit day of any given tower. They had worked out that 2 of the towers had design flaws in their coolant management systems that, if left unaddressed, would have produced cascading failures within 3 years. They had filed the documentation on those flaws through the secondary channel, received no response, and corrected the flaws themselves, on their own initiative, using spare materials from the Commission's own supply stock and labor that fell outside any existing work order. They had identified pressure anomalies, rerouted data buffers, recalibrated routing algorithms that the original design had left set to parameters suitable for an earlier generation of traffic volume. They had, in short, taken a system designed by people who expected someone else to deal with the details and made it work. Year after year, without acknowledgement, without additional pay, without ever receiving a response from the secondary channel that amounted to anything more than a form acknowledgement. They had kept records of everything they did, every modification, every off-schedule intervention, every design flaw corrected, every emergency response, because they were professionals and professionals keep records. The Commission had no corresponding records. The Commission's maintenance file for the Verath corridor showed contract start date, contract term, auxiliary rate, and periodic inspection sign-offs. It did not show what actually happened in those towers. It showed what the paperwork showed. After the reclassification vote, I requested, through the Standard Records channel, the Commission's complete technical file for all 14 towers. The Records Office produced it within 2 weeks. I spent 1 night reading it and confirmed what I had suspected. The Commission's file was a shadow. It knew the towers existed. It knew the maintenance schedule as written, not as executed. It did not know the rationalized architecture. It did not know the corrected design flaws. It did not know the synchronized rotation or the reasons for it. The subsidiary that had just received the 4 high-traffic towers had received the contract documents from that shadow file. Nothing else. I did not flag this. I submitted no correction. I filed no advisory notice. I drafted a message to the 14 tower crews. I sent it through our internal communications channel, not the Commission's infrastructure. We maintained a parallel channel for crew coordination, another thing we had built ourselves because the Commission's official channel had a routing delay that made real-time crew coordination impractical. The crews read it. Then they began making their own calculations. We had, by that point, 49 human personnel on Commission-adjacent postings throughout the station and the corridor. 49 people, technicians, liaison staff, administrative support, 2 medical officers, 1 structural engineer who had spent 4 years assessing the Commission's relay infrastructure, and had produced a comprehensive assessment that the Commission had received and filed without reading. 49 people and 3 weeks, and no announcement of any kind. The Commission's subsidiary took possession of its 4 towers on the 14th day of the new contract cycle. Their team was 8 strong, less than half the crew density our teams had maintained, and they had been briefed from the shadow file. On day 1, they discovered that the coolant management system on Tower 11 was configured differently from the technical specifications. They spent 2 days troubleshooting. On day 4, They experienced their first partial shutdown when an automatic failsafe triggered in response to a coolant pressure reading their briefing documents had not mentioned. They filed a fault report with the Commission's maintenance division. The fault report arrived the same day I filed my last invoice. The same day, I walked out of the annex office and did not come back. I want to be precise about what the silence was and what it was not. It was not a strike. We had no formal labor framework with the Commission. We were auxiliary service providers, not employees, and auxiliary service providers do not strike, because you can only strike against an entity that acknowledges you as a party to a labor relationship. The Commission did not acknowledge us as a party to anything. What we did was simply cease to perform services that we were not, in any enforceable sense, required to perform. Our auxiliary contracts had expired at the end of the prior fiscal cycle. The Commission had sent renewal instruments through the secondary channel. I had acknowledged receipt. I had not signed them. I had submitted instead a request for a rate review, a formal request, properly filed, citing the rate differential between auxiliary and primary contracts, and providing a calculation of the cumulative underpayment over 11 years. The request had been pending for 4 months when I filed the last invoice. When I did not sign the renewal instruments, our contracts lapsed. Under Commission procedural rules, a lapsed auxiliary contract triggered an administrative review, which was required to be completed within 45 days. The review would then produce either a renewed contract or a formal notice of contract termination. In the 45-day window, absent a renewed contract, no work was formally assigned to our teams. Our teams were not, technically, obligated to perform work under an expired contract. They did not perform it. Every one of our 49 people stood down, quietly, without announcement. The tower crews completed their final shift under the expired contract terms. Everything orderly, everything properly logged, proper handover documentation prepared for a handover that no one on the Commission side was ready to receive. They left the stations tidy. They left the systems in stable operating condition, the stable operating condition they had personally built and maintained for 8 years, not the stable operating condition the Commission's file described. They secured the access points. They ran their final diagnostics. They completed their logbooks with the same precision they had applied every rotation. And then they stopped. There was no meeting about it, no collective declaration, no dramatic moment of consensus. I had sent one message, weeks before, outlining the situation. The crew chiefs had received it and passed word through the rotations in the way that professional crews communicate important things, quietly, without excess, with the kind of understated clarity that means everyone understands and no one needs to speak further. By the time the contracts lapsed, every person knew what was happening and what their part in it was. They did their jobs to the end and then they put them down. The Commission's maintenance division sent a standard activation message to our tower crews on the first day of the new cycle. Our teams did not respond. The maintenance division sent a follow-up. Our teams did not respond. The maintenance division escalated to the Commission's liaison office, which sent a message to the Annex Building's general address. The Annex Building's general address was no longer monitored. I was, by that time, in transit. I had notified Varith Station's port authority of my departure, proper notification, properly filed, through the correct channel, because that is the kind of thing our people did, and I had boarded a human flag transport, and I was no longer in the Varath corridor. All 49 of us were, within 11 days, no longer in the Varath corridor. What followed I know from accounts, from records, from the Commission's own session transcripts, which are public documents and which I have read with a careful attention I did not previously believe I was capable of. On day 12 of the new contract cycle, Tower 7, one of the 10 towers that had remained in our scope until the contract lapsed, experienced a cascade fault in its data routing buffer. The fault was of a category that our team had been managing on a 6-week preventive cycle for 3 years, having identified it as a slow-onset structural issue in year 5, and having addressed it continuously without it ever appearing in the formal work order log, because the work had been done as part of a broader maintenance sweep that was logged under a different work order category. The Commission's maintenance division had no record of the underlying issue. Their emergency response team was dispatched 2 days after the fault triggered because the first 24 hours were spent determining which team had responsibility for Tower 7 under the current contract structure. The answer, it turned out, was no team. Tower 7 had been in our scope. Our scope had lapsed. No one had been assigned Tower 7. 2 days of routing downtime on Tower 7 reduced throughput on the upper corridor segment by 31%. The Commission's commercial traffic monitoring reported the disruption within hours. 3 member species commercial operators filed complaints with the Commission's Trade Operations Office before the emergency response team even reached the tower. On day 17, the subsidiary managing the 4 high-traffic towers filed its own emergency report. Their team had discovered, while performing a scheduled maintenance check on Tower 11, that the corrected coolant management configuration was not isolated to Tower 11. It was present in all 4 towers they had been assigned, and the configurations differed from their technical specifications in ways that their team did not understand, and that required, at minimum, a complete resurvey of all 4 towers before any further maintenance activity could safely proceed. They were standing down pending clarification. All 4 of the corridor's highest traffic towers went to reduced operational status simultaneously. The throughput impact was measurable within hours. It propagated outward through the corridor, affecting relay handoffs beyond the corridor's boundaries, triggering automated rerouting protocols in adjacent transit lanes that increased transit times, and in 3 cases, caused missed delivery windows for time-sensitive commercial shipments. One of those shipments was a consignment of calibrated instruments bound for a Verath industrial facility whose production cycle depended on scheduled delivery. The facility's production supervisor filed a formal disruption claim within 18 hours. The claim arrived on the Commission's commercial desk the same morning that the 4th, 5th, and 6th fault reports came in from the corridor. By day 20, the Commission's Trade Operations Division had escalated to the Standing Committee on Commercial Infrastructure. By day 22, the committee had called an emergency plenary session. The session transcript runs to 86 pages in the public record. I have read it in full more than once. I want to be accurate. The session opened with the chair of the Commercial Infrastructure Committee presenting the disruption data. The numbers were stark. Throughput along the upper corridor segment was at 37% of baseline. The aggregate cost of filed commercial claims was a figure the committee chair read aloud twice to ensure the chamber had heard correctly. The anticipated additional disruption cost, if the situation was not resolved within the next transit cycle, was sufficient to affect the Commission's own operating budget for the quarter. 3 of the 7 member species had commercial interests directly impacted. 2 of them had delegates in the chamber who had been receiving messages from their commercial boards since before the session convened. The first order of business was an emergency review of the contract status. The Commission's legal office presented. Auxiliary contracts with the Terran Commerce Office had lapsed. Renewal instruments had been issued and not signed. A rate review request had been pending for 4 months. No renewal had been executed. No emergency engagement authority had been invoked. The legal office's representative paused here, and the transcript notes that the pause was followed by a question from the committee chair. Why had no emergency authority been invoked? The answer was what changed the register of the room. The Commission's emergency engagement protocols, the legal office explained, specified that emergency engagement authority applied to member species contractors. The Terran Commerce Office held auxiliary status. There was no provision in the current procedural framework for emergency engagement of an auxiliary service provider whose contract had lapsed. The emergency framework had been written on the assumption that critical infrastructure would be managed by members. The chamber transcript does not quantify the silence that followed. It records only that the presiding council president called for order before the next speaker was recognized. A delegate from one of the founding member species, the Verath, who had built the original infrastructure and who had, at founding, made the determination that maintenance work was below the threshold of strategic significance, asked how it was possible that critical infrastructure was not managed by members. The legal office explained the auxiliary contract structure. The delegate asked how long humans had held these contracts. The legal office said 11 years. The delegate asked what the commission had paid them. The legal office said 63% of the primary rate. The transcript records another silence. When it broke, two delegates spoke simultaneously, and the presiding council called for order a second time. Eventually, someone retrieved the original survey assessment, the 11-day orbital survey, the report drafted without a single face-to-face human contact. It was read into the record. The chamber president asked when it had last been formally reviewed. The answer was never. It had been filed and subsequently cited as precedent, but no formal review had ever been conducted, because no such review could be initiated without a member sponsor, and no member had ever been motivated to sponsor one. The delegate who had first asked about the survey report said, in a tone the transcript describes as measured, the commission had apparently been content to allow itself to be served for 11 years at 63% of the rate it would have paid a member, on the basis of an assessment conducted by a surveyor who had never spoken to a human being. No one responded to that directly. The transcript records only that the presiding council called a recess. The recess was 45 minutes. What was said during it is not in any public record. When the session resumed, the chamber president announced that, under the extraordinary circumstances provision of the Commission's foundational charter, a provision that had been included at founding and never subsequently invoked, the presiding council was initiating a formal review of the pre-framework classification applicable to the Terran Commerce Office and the species it represented. The debate on this motion lasted 6 hours. It was not unanimous. There were objections, procedural objections, substantive objections, objections that amounted to an argument that a review initiated under economic duress was not a review properly motivated. One delegate said explicitly that the Commission should not allow itself to be maneuvered. The delegate who had asked about the survey report said, without heat, that the question of who had been doing the maneuvering and for how long was worth considering before the chamber committed itself to that framing. The motion passed 5-2. The presiding council's vote counted. 3 days later, Councillor Vass delivered the written instrument to my transport. I was 4 transit days from Varath Station when he found us. The Commission had spent 3 days attempting to contact me through channels I was no longer monitoring, had located my transport through the Port Authority departure record I had properly filed, and had managed to dispatch Councillor Vass aboard the next available vessel to intercept. He came aboard at a way station transfer, carrying a formal case and the expression of a man who was genuinely unsure what he was going to find. He was a small man by Varethi standards, which still made him taller than I was. He wore the Commission's formal diplomatic insignia, a graduated chain of pale stone links, each link engraved with the Commission's emblem. He had a careful manner and careful eyes, and I could see that behind the careful manner he was genuinely alarmed, and that the alarm was real rather than performed. He had been a Commission official for 20 years, and in 20 years he had never been sent after someone. The Commission did not send people after auxiliary service providers. The Commission sent form acknowledgments and procedural rulings, and when those failed, additional form acknowledgments. It did not charter an intercept vessel and dispatch a senior counselor to a mid-transit way station. I let him find his bearings before I said anything. I let him sit down, set down his case, and settle his breathing. I had spent 6 years walking a covered walkway to a building attached to someone else's complex. I had spent 107 sessions in a gallery looking at the backs of people who had decided I was not worth seating. I had spent 11 years filing documents through a secondary channel at 63% of what the work was worth. I was not in a hurry. He had brought the Commission's full technical file on the Verath corridor. He laid it on the table between us, as though it were a gesture of good faith. I recognized it. I had read it in one night 3 years earlier. The Commission, he said, wishes to resolve the current contract situation expeditiously. I looked at the file. There have been some operational disruptions, he said, that the Commission's technical staff are working to address. In the meantime, there is significant concern about throughput continuity along the corridor, and the Commission is prepared to move quickly on contract renewal. I said nothing. He waited. Then, if there are concerns about the current rate structure, the Commission is prepared to convene a formal review. Still nothing from me. The Commission, he said, with slightly less careful calm, is prepared to consider an adjustment to the auxiliary rate. I reached into the folder I had brought to this meeting, not the Commission's folder, mine, and I placed one document on the table. It was a copy of the rate review request I had filed 4 months before walking out. I had the Commission's receipt acknowledgement clipped to the front. He looked at it. This was filed, I said. It was not reviewed. He picked it up. He read the first 2 pages. He set it down. I understand, he said. The corridor has 10 more towers, I said. Your subsidiary has 4. 3 of the 10 have the same coolant configuration issue as Tower 11. I have the correction documentation. The correction was done by our teams on our time with your supply stock. Your file doesn't show it. He was very still. Tower 7's cascade fault is a slow onset buffer issue. It's been managed preventively for 3 years. Your emergency team won't find documentation because it was never entered as a standalone work order. I have the maintenance logs. I placed the maintenance logs on the table. 3 years of records, everything our teams had done that never appeared in the Commission's file. He looked at the stack. There are 6 additional structural issues across the remaining 9 towers, I said. Documented, ongoing, managed. I placed those records on the table. We have the only complete operational picture of the corridor. He said nothing for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was quiet and precise, in the way of someone who has decided to say the important thing plainly. The Commission is prepared to discuss full member status review. I looked at him. He met my eyes. He was not comfortable, and he was not dissembling. He was a man who had been sent to offer something large, and who was waiting to see if large was enough. The Commission, I said, has a procedural framework that requires a member sponsor. The President has the authority to initiate a direct review under extraordinary circumstances. That authority has never been exercised. It will be. I held his gaze for a moment longer. Then I collected my documents from the table. Not all of them. I left the maintenance logs. He would need them for the immediate repairs. We were professionals. The towers mattered. The ships that depended on the corridor mattered. Whatever the Commission was, the commerce it carried mattered to people who were not the Commission, and I had not walked away to let infrastructure fail. I had walked away to be found. I will need the review request in writing, I said. Formally filed, primary channel. He nodded once. I will need it in 3 days. You'll have it. I stood up. One more thing, I said. He waited. The invoice I filed on my last day, 47 line items, the outstanding 37% of 11 years of auxiliary contracts. He was very still again. That will be part of the written instrument. Yes, he said quietly. I left him at the table. 3 days later, Counselor Vass delivered the instrument. I have it still. It sits in the same folder as the original rate review request, the 11-year payment calculation, and the copy of the survey assessment that was written by a man who never looked at one of us. I keep them together because that is what the history is, the original erasure, the documented case built inside an erasure, and the moment the erasure became too expensive to sustain. Some days that folder is the most clarifying thing I own. It is a formal document, properly executed on the Commission's primary channel, with a case number and a session reference. It initiates a full status review. It acknowledges the pending rate review request. It contains, in its third paragraph, a payment authorization for the full outstanding amount of the invoice I submitted on my last day, 47 line items, 37% of 11 years of contracts. It is not a seat in the chamber. It is a beginning. I know what the Commission is. I know how slowly it moves when it moves in our favor and how efficiently it moves when it moves against us. I am not optimistic. I am not naive. But when Counselor Vass handed me that instrument and I read through it in his presence, I felt something I had not felt in a long time. Not triumph exactly. Not relief. Something closer to recognition. I want to tell you about Petra Sondergaard, because she is the person I think about when people ask me how this happened. Petra was a relay technician, 26 years old when she took her first posting to the corridor. She had come up through the technical training programs at home, had done her first posting at a deep space relay station, and had volunteered specifically for the corridor because the pay was the highest available, and she had student loans and a younger sister whose education she was helping fund. She was practical, she was skilled, and she had the particular quality that the best technicians share. She paid attention to what the system was actually doing, not just to what it was supposed to be doing. It was Petra who first noticed the buffer degradation in Tower 7. She was in her second corridor rotation, 14 months in, running a standard diagnostic sweep that was part of her regular maintenance cycle. The degradation was minor, well within acceptable parameters, not flagged by the automated monitoring. She noted it in her crew log. Then she checked the tower's historical data and found that the degradation rate, while slow, was consistent. The buffer was trending down at a rate that, if unaddressed, would produce a significant fault within 3 years. Maybe 2.5, on the faster end of her projection. She filed a report through the secondary channel. She received no response. 6 weeks later, she ran the diagnostic again, confirmed the trend, and began addressing it proactively as part of her maintenance sweeps. A 40-minute addition to her regular cycle, every 6 weeks, for the next 3 years. She never filed a separate work order for it. The extra 40 minutes didn't fit neatly into any existing work order category, and she knew that filing a new category would require a commission approval process that would take longer than the next maintenance sweep. So she absorbed it into her regular work, noted it in her internal logs, briefed her successors on it during each rotation handover, and kept doing it. When our contracts lapsed, Petra stood down with everyone else. She documented everything, the degradation trend, the intervention protocol, the current state of the buffer, and prepared handover notes for the Commission's emergency team, which were part of the maintenance logs I placed on the table in front of Counselor Vass. She was one of the 49. She went back to her tower the day the maintenance logs were handed over, not because the Commission had asked her to, but because the tower needed the attention and she was the person who understood it. She received no additional acknowledgement for this. She did not ask for any. That is what the Commission did not have a category for. Not just the decision to stop. the discipline to stop, and the discipline to go back, and the knowledge, cultivated over years of unglamorous work in a place no one in the chamber ever thought about, that told her the difference between the two. I filed a crew commendation into our internal records when I got back to my desk. Standard form. No external addressee. She would not have wanted one. They had a classification for every species they encountered. They had a procedural box for every entity that sought to engage with them, and every box determined what that entity could do, what it could be paid, what rights it could access, what room it could sit in. The classification system was 11,000 pages long and self-reinforcing, and had been optimized over decades to produce outcomes that favored the entities who had written it. They had no box for what we did, not the work, but the decision. They had never modeled the scenario in which the auxiliary simply stopped. In 11,000 pages of procedural framework, there was no protocol for silence. No emergency authority applicable to the lapse of a non-member contract. No mechanism for compelling continued service from an entity that was not formally within the commission structure. They had built their infrastructure, assigned its maintenance to people they did not consider worth seating at the table, and it had simply not occurred to them, not to any of them, not once in 11 years, that the arrangement required our consent. The towers needed us. The corridor needed us. The commerce that moved through it needed us. They had never thought to ask if we needed anything in return. I do not know what the review will produce. I know the Commission's procedural history, and I know that these things take time, and I know that what you win at the table and what you are actually given are not always the same thing. I have 2 filing cabinets worth of experience with the distance between those 2 things. I expect the review to be slow and contested, and to produce an outcome that is smaller than what we asked for and larger than what they wanted to give. I expect procedural delays and supplemental filings and objections on grounds that will take a lawyer 6 hours to explain. I have already retained one. What I do not expect is to be ignored. That is the thing that changed. Not the outcome. The outcome is still uncertain, and I am too experienced to mistake a formal review instrument for a settled question. But the Commission, for 40 years, had operated on the assumption that we could be managed through the secondary channel, that our submissions could be received and not acknowledged, that our petitions could be filed and not read, that our labor could be used and undercompensated, and that, because we had no formal standing within their structure, there was nothing we could do that would compel their attention. They discovered there was one thing. We could stop. Not a protest, not a demonstration, not a filing, something the procedural framework had no category for, because the procedural framework had been built to manage entities that wanted something from the Commission, and the only lever it recognized was the granting or withholding of Commission recognition. Take away the desire for recognition, and the framework has no handle left to grip. We had spent 11 years wanting recognition badly enough to accept almost anything short of it. The moment we stopped wanting it badly enough to accept the status quo, the entire structure of management that the Commission had built around us ceased to function. They came to us. After 40 years of us going to them, walking the covered walkway, sitting in the gallery, filing through the secondary channel, they sent someone to us. I have been informed that when we return to Varith Station for the formal review proceedings, the Terran Commerce Office will be assigned permanent office space in the main complex. Primary channel, different room. It is a beginning, and it was earned, and the only sound it took was the sound of 49 people going quiet at the same moment, and staying quiet long enough for the chamber to notice what the silence meant. We had been invisible for 40 years, not because we lacked presence, but because we occupied the space they had decided was beneath their notice. The maintenance corridors, the debris fields, the 18-month postings where nothing was comfortable and everything was necessary. We had kept the lights on in a structure that preferred not to see who was holding the switch. They understand it now. The ones who understand it fully are in the minority. Most of them understand only the disruption and only the cost, and that is a thinner understanding, but it will have to do. Change in bodies like the Commission does not come from enlightenment. It comes from ledger lines. We did not speak. We simply stopped making the sound they had learned to ignore. That was enough.